It's my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight our speaker. Candice Millard is an excellent writer, formerly of National Geographic magazine, and now we're very excited to have her here to talk about her second book. Her first book was The River of Doubt, about Theodore Roosevelt's perilous journey down the Amazon after his presidency. And we're very, very pleased here that she's chosen to tackle another interesting presidential subject, that being the assassination of President James Garfield. I believe this is her third or fourth trip here to the site between research and other things she's done here for us and with us, and it's really a great pleasure to welcome him here tonight. Please make her feel welcome, Candice Millard.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Todd, and thank you all for coming. It is a real pleasure to be here, and it is a great honor to be able to speak at the James Garfield National Historic Site. And I also wanted to say a particular thank you to the Garfield family as well, which has been incredibly kind and generous and helpful to me throughout this whole process. So thank you so much. At heart, this book is not about politics or science or even the shooting of a president. It's about an extraordinary drama that took place inside the White House over more than 2 months. In the 130 years since Garfield's death, his story has been largely forgotten. But even at the time, even though the entire nation, the entire world was watching, no one really understood what was happening. What began as a shooting became an incredible struggle for power and ambition. The result was the brutal death of one of our most promising leaders at the hands of his own physicians. This is an intimate, heartbreaking story of ignorance versus science, greed versus heroism. James Garfield was not, as he has often been remembered to be, just a bland, bearded 19th century politician. On the contrary, that's the wrong picture. I'm not sure what went up, but on the contrary, he was one of the most extraordinary men ever elected president. Although he was born into desperate poverty, he became a professor of literature, mathematics, and ancient languages when he was just a sophomore in college. By the time he was 26 years old, he was a college president. He knew the entire Aeneid by heart in Latin. While he was in Congress, he wrote an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem. To me, though, what is more inspirational and more astonishing, even than Garfield's brilliance, was his decency. You know, I wrote a book about Theodore Roosevelt, and I have great admiration for him. He was a firebrand. He was the hero, the center of every drama. That's not Garfield. Garfield was the calmest, wisest man in the room. He was a good, kind, honest man who was just trying his best. He was a real person, not consumed by ego and ambition, someone who was simply trying to do the right thing. Even after 17 years in Congress, in one of the most ruthless, vicious eras of machine politics, Garfield never changed. His friends used to marvel at his patience and forbearance, even in the face of the most brutal personal attacks. But Garfield was incapable of holding a grudge. He used to just shrug and say, "I'm a poor hater." Although Garfield took his presidency very seriously, he had never had what he called presidential fever. In fact, he never really ran for any office. People asked him to run, and he did, but he would never even campaign. He always made it clear that he was going to follow his own conscience and convictions, and if people didn't agree with him, they shouldn't vote for him. When Garfield went to the Republican convention in the summer of 1880, not only was he not a candidate, he didn't even want to be one. He had gone there to give a speech, and he was kicking himself because he wasn't prepared. He wrote a letter home telling his wife that he was just sick about the fact that he hadn't written the speech before the convention, and now he wouldn't have time. The convention was an enormous hall in Chicago. There were 15,000 people there, and the favorite to win by far was Ulysses S. Grant, who was trying for a third term in the White House. In the midst of this chaos and noise of thousands of people, Garfield got up to speak, and his speech was so powerful and so eloquent, and again, largely extemporaneous, that the hall slowly fell silent until the only thing you could hear was Garfield's voice. And everyone was just riveted. They were spellbound. And at one point, Garfield said, "And so, gentlemen, I ask you, what do we want?" And someone shouted, "We want Garfield!" And the entire hall just went crazy. And when the balloting began, delegates began casting their ballots for Garfield, even though, again, he wasn't even a candidate. And he stood up and he objected, but the votes kept coming, and he couldn't stop what was happening. And what was a trickle became a stream, became a river, and then finally a flood of votes. And before Garfield knew it, he was the Republican nominee for President of the United States. What I found again and again and again while I was researching this book was that not only was Garfield's life and nomination and brief presidency full of incredible stories, but the people who surrounded him were also unbelievable. You just couldn't make them up. First, of course, there's Charles Guiteau, Garfield's would-be assassin. Guiteau was a deeply, dangerously delusional man, but he was very intelligent and highly articulate. If you read nearly any other account of Garfield's assassination, Guiteau is described as a disgruntled office seeker. But that doesn't cover the smallest part of it. He was a uniquely American character. He was a product of this country at that time, a time when there was a lot of play in the joints, and there was no one to really understand what he was up to and hold him to account for it. Guiteau was a self-made madman. He was smart and scrappy. He was a clever opportunist, and he would probably have been very successful if he hadn't been insane. Guiteau had tried everything, and he had failed at everything. He had tried law, evangelism, even a free love commune in the 1800s, and he had failed even at that. The women in the commune nicknamed him Charles Guiteau. But he survived on sheer audacity. He traveled all over the country by train and never bought a ticket. He took great pride in moving from boarding house to boarding house, slipping out when the rent was due. And even when he occasionally worked as a bill collector, he would just keep whatever he managed to collect. After the Republican convention, Guiteau became obsessed with Garfield, and immediately after the election, he began to stalk the president. He went to the White House nearly every day. At one point, he even walked into the president's office while the president was in it. He even attended a reception and introduced himself to Garfield's wife. He shook her hand, he gave her his card, and he slowly pronounced his name so she wouldn't forget him. It's like a Hitchcock movie. It's incredibly creepy and absolutely terrifying. Finally, Guiteau had what he believed was a divine inspiration. God wanted him to kill the president. It was nothing personal, he would later say, simply God's will. As strange and fascinating and nearly as dangerous as Guiteau was Senator Roscoe Conkling. And that's Chester Arthur. We've skipped a picture. Conkling, we're skipping pictures. Conkling was a vain, preening, brutally powerful machine politician who appointed himself Garfield's enemy. He wore